In 2014, jobs are scarce, and the whole process of getting one is very complicated. When you apply for a job, you have to fill in a form telling your employer your religion, your race, even your sexuality. But the people appointing you or interviewing you aren't allowed to know any of that, or if you're married, or your age, or whether you have a disability. Why? Well, in case they discriminate against you. Things were a lot simpler back in the 1960s.
The Catholic boys and men around this district, or any Catholic district, can't pick and choose their jobs. As that woman has told you, the Protestants gets the pick of the jobs.
They're out for civil rights and they've no civil rights to be out for. You take a man here of a Protestant who's working and his basic wage is 12 to 14 pounds per week. You take a man on the Roman Catholic side who's no call to work. His wages of the government are 20 to 25 pounds a week.
There's nothing right with being a Roman Catholic. The Protestants have better privileges and everything else.
In the past, there may well have been discrimination, but nowadays there's very, very little.
I fought for 18 years in the army for liberty and freedom, but simply because I'm a Catholic, I cannot get freedom or liberty here.
Discrimination in employment was a major divisive issue in Northern Ireland in the 1960s, and in 1969 that anger and resentment boiled over. Even years later, lack of fairness in employment was said to be a major cause of the Troubles. According to Martin McGuinness, one of the main reasons he became a Republican was not necessarily what flag flew over public buildings.
When I was 15 years of age, I walked into a unionist-owned business in Derry. I was asked my name. I said Martin McGuinness. It's not spelled the same way as Ken's. They asked me then what school I went to. And when I told them the Christian Brothers School, I was shown the door.
Martin McGuinness and his cohorts are coming from the killing of 2,200 people because he said he didn't get a job in 19-something or other.
I think it's slightly more complicated than that, Ken McGuinness.
So there you have it. Martin McGuinness could have been a car mechanic instead of a Deputy First Minister. Nowadays, we take the issue of fairness in employment for granted. We're all used to the culture of equal opportunities. But it wasn't always like that. This is the story of fair employment in Northern Ireland. The issue of discrimination in employment goes way back. I mean, in 1690 we even fought a war over whether a Catholic or a Protestant should get the job as king. But we don't have to go that far back. Lack of fairness in employment was a problem that stretched back to the 1900s and even before then.
It was very much a feature before partition. Belfast shipyards, for example, tended to have a very small percentage of Catholic workers, and many of those were expelled in the sectarian violence of the early 1920s.
Edward Carson, who contributed so much to the foundation of Northern Ireland, was offered the post of Prime Minister, but declined, preferring to live in England. And he still got a statue up at Stormont. But when the Northern Ireland state was created, Carson had a warning for his fellow Unionists.
I want to remind you of one great Unionist, Edward Carson, when he said, "Look after the minority." We didn't. And have we suffered for it?
Many Unionists, even Ian Paisley, now concede that Carson's words might have fallen on a few deaf ears. But what was the actual extent of discrimination in employment? Well, this is Northern Ireland, so views vary.
Discrimination was systematic, it was structural, it was endemic, it was planned.
There was discrimination in Northern Ireland. I would just add that it was probably on both sides as well.
I think there was a factory of grievances. I think that's what part of the civil rights was about. Let's try and produce as big a list of grievances as we can. Many of them were grossly over-egged, and I think employment discrimination was one of them. The Unionist Party ran the government of Northern Ireland from the 1920s to 1972, a period which many nationalists have described as 50 years of Unionist misrule. But this was not the southern states of America. Protestants didn't own Catholic slaves.
Nor was it apartheid South Africa. Discrimination was not enshrined in law. But it is clear that a culture of discrimination and unfairness was allowed to flourish.
There's a famous saying that I always remember: "You'd neither in ye nor on ye, but we were in power." So it was always about, you might think you in the Protestant working class are doing really, really badly, but look at them across the way.
Lord Craigavon, very famously, within 18 months of Stormont being opened, says, "All I boast is we are a Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state." His Agriculture Minister, Sir Basil Brooke, a future wartime Prime Minister, actually urges Protestant employers in 1933 to employ only Protestant lads and lassies and not Roman Catholics who are 99% disloyal and are out to cut our throats. And then we have the famous one, of course, of J.M. Andrews, Minister of Labour and a future Prime Minister, who actually says in 1933 that there are rumours that the number of porters at Stormont are Roman Catholic, but he has counted them, and of actually 31 porters, 30 are Protestant, one is a Catholic, but he's only temporary. He actually makes this speech. Dawson Bates was in charge of everything: the police, the electoral system, the strong man of the cabinet, former organiser of the UVF. And he's there for over 20 years in this key position. But Dawson Bates refused to use a telephone at Stormont when he discovered that somewhere among that mass of young ladies there was a Roman Catholic telephonist. Now this takes some beating, you know. When the Prime Minister and the Minister of Home Affairs in charge of the police adopt these attitudes, it's not surprising that they might be replicated among employers. Many ordinary people didn't think in those terms at all. They had great neighbourly relationships. They would employ their neighbours at harvest time and all the rest of it. But there was a political culture embedded, I think, in the unionist system and in the unionist state.
All of the empirical evidence clearly shows that there was rampant discrimination against the Catholic community. And I think it also clearly shows that there were many people in the Protestant community who didn't do that well either, because effectively the northern state was being controlled by a hierarchy of people who looked after their own.
It was the powers that be, the landed gentry, the sirs, the majors and the lords, ably assisted by some of our big daily newspapers, that played that orange card.
Unionists argued that discrimination was exaggerated, that much Catholic unemployment was due to them having larger families or to geography.
The areas you have mentioned, they haven't high unemployment because they're Catholic, but simply because they are based on the periphery of Ulster. They're away in the west, most of them, and Newry is deep in the south.
Because of the economic setup, mostly initiated or maintained by a socialist government across the water, unemployment is sometimes very attractive, particularly to people with large families.
They also said that discrimination wasn't always one way. In areas where Catholics were in the majority, they tended to discriminate against Protestants.
One side is just as bad as the other. And it's the trades union principle. They want their own people. They want their own people in their own businesses.
With housing as one of the political issues, unemployment is the other. In Derry, unemployment has always been high. Today, 1 man in 5 is out of work. And here, too, religion complicates the problem.
Every time they asked you what school you were at, and when you say St Columbus, that's it, there are no vacancies.
It's not the Protestants, it's these people that's on the Guildhall and up in Stormont is making the difference. The Protestants and the Catholics could live here all right if they were left alone to live.
I know the person who in the 1960s, his job when he was employed as a civil servant, he's Protestant, but he told me his job was to put a star beside the names of the Catholics who were applying for boards to get promoted and so on, and even applying to get into the civil service.
This is BBC Northern Ireland.
Ulster stands at the crossroads.
At this crucial time, Northern Ireland had a new Prime Minister, Captain Terence O'Neill. Unlike his predecessors, O'Neill knew things had to change, and for a time it looked like he might be the man to do it.
I think by the 60s O'Neill appears to be addressing this. He's trying to improve community relations, but it's very much gesture politics. It's the visit to a convent school, you know, it's a civic week in Ballynahinch. It's nothing of any substance.
Well, I was going to see a girl at one moment.
Cardinal Conway actually accuses O'Neill of raising Catholic expectations and then dashing them. And that seems to be the green light for the emergence of a movement on the streets.
Now, gentlemen, please! God save us all!
Do you think that the recent riots could have been avoided if you'd done more to deal with the grievances of Catholics?
I didn't have any particular grievances put to me. It's only recently that those have been stirred up, chiefly by, I suppose you are aware that the composition of those riots was not entirely those people who were suffering from a civil grievance. It was composed of Irish Republican Army, admittedly by them, and by communists.
Can you think of things which could have been done to ease Catholic discrimination?
Yes, it could have been done, but been politically very difficult because of the antipathy of the Roman Catholics and the fact that they were backing the Irish Republican Army, who were out to defeat Northern Ireland and to shoot our people.
5, 4, 3.
I am speaking to you tonight as your Prime Minister for the last time.
You have O'Neill's famous speech a month after he lost office in 1969, when he's rationalising his policy of good feeling towards the nationalist population. And he said, you know, you can't make extreme unionists understand that if you give a Catholic a house and treat them well, they will live like Protestants, unlike the Catholic in a terrible hovel who will have 18 children. They will see their Protestant neighbours with televisions and cars, and they will ape their habits. And he seems to be explaining, it's racist, obviously, it's condescending.
It's easy to be hard on O'Neill, but we have to remember this was the first time a unionist Prime Minister tacitly admitted that Catholics were being treated unfairly in Northern Ireland. And he did it a mere 45 years before Ian Paisley. But by 1969, we were far beyond arguments about fairness and justice. The discrimination issue fed the belief among nationalists that Northern Ireland was an irreformable sectarian state.
Part of the source of the conflict was the fact that the nationalist stroke Catholic community were discriminated against, could see no other way out of it.
The irony was, of course, that within months of the start of the Troubles, most of the demands of the civil rights movement had been met. But there was one elephant still sitting in the room: discrimination in employment.
In September 1971, I applied for a job as a librarian, and in the course of the interview they asked me what school I had gone to, and I said I went to St Peter's Secondary School in Britain's Parade, and one of them turned around and says, "Oh, is that where Joe Cahill gave his press conference?" A few weeks after the introduction of internment, the school had been empty for the summer holidays, and yes, Joe Cahill had given a IRA interview at the school. So they told me, well, you'll be hearing from us, and it's now 2014 and I still don't know whether I've got the job.
Amid the escalating violence, the Stormont government was abolished in 1972 and replaced by direct rule from Westminster.
In our endeavours to provide just government in Ulster have been betrayed from London.
Discrimination in employment was now a problem for the government in London.
Everyone knows that there has been a strong Protestant tradition in Holland, of course, over the years. The management have made perfectly clear, and so have I, that we are seeking a balanced workforce in the future. That is what we are going to do, and everybody is going to work to that end.
But it took another 4 years. In 1976, the government passed the Fair Employment Act and set up the Fair Employment Agency. For the first time, it was unlawful to discriminate in employment. So, that was that sorted. Well, not quite.
I believe in miracles.
The agency had a tiny staff. The law was weak and ineffective. Employers had little to fear from a body with so few powers. If you felt you'd been discriminated against, the Fair Employment Agency could investigate your complaint, but the whole thing was conducted in private.
The 1976 Act was complete rubbish. It was so that when someone questioned the British could say, look, we're completely opposed to discrimination. In fact, we have a law which is outlawing discrimination. But it just made it illegal to discriminate. You couldn't prove it.
Of course there's a place in the firm for you. After all, you were recommended by one of our own people. Mind you, well, we're looking for someone with more experience. But you should fit in very nicely.
In Northern Ireland, some people get jobs because of who they know, not what they know, or because they're one religion, not the other. Give ability a fair chance. Pick the best person for the job.
The agency had very limited compliance powers, so there was a good deal of hearts and minds work that was being done, and really that was my role.
If I remember right, you advertised that job. Suppose he was the best you could get.
Well, that's just it. He wasn't. There was a better person applied for the job, but I didn't think he'd fit in, if you see what I mean.
No, I don't see what you mean.
He dug with the wrong foot. The wrong sort. Not one of us. Wrong religion. Do I have to spell it out?
I'll tell you something you will have to spell out, Arthur. How can your business afford cock-ups like that? How can anyone's business afford not to employ the best person?
Don't rub it in. I've already learned the hard way.
When the government set up the Fair Employment Agency, they needed someone to lead it, to lead the campaign to end discrimination against Catholics. So they chose a Protestant unionist.
I would accept that there are problems for Protestants in particular areas of employment. The biggest problem, and the reason the agency was set up, was because of the problems for Catholics, and I think that still remains at the present time, though I hope it is a diminishing problem.
The fact that Bob had been so heavily involved in politics and was quite high profile, and certainly been heavily involved in the whole process of fair employment right from the beginning, was a huge asset in my view.
He was very political. He had initially joined the Ulster Unionist Party and then was important in establishing the Alliance Party.
What significance would you attach to this bombing?
It's certainly very inconvenient a couple of days before the election. I think it's an attempt by some men of violence to get at a political party which is working for peace and reconciliation. I think the interesting thing is that we wouldn't have a clue which side is doing it, because both sides have reason to dislike us. Both sides are opposed to what we're trying to achieve.
In the power sharing executive, he'd been the Minister for Manpower, and he had seen, of course, firsthand the impact of the Ulster Workers' strike, which brought down that government. And so for him, he knew that there would be no society if it wasn't an equal society.
Republicans thought he was just a Brit lackey. Unionists said he led the Fenian Employment Commission.
It seems to me that the attitude within unionist circles, they don't think it's a fair employment agency, and I'm sorry to use this word, they see it as a Catholic employment agency.
We never worked on the basis that employers all over Northern Ireland were waking up and their first waking thought was, how can I keep X or Y out of my workforce?
The Sirocco Engineering Works in East Belfast extends into Short Strand, yet the workforce has traditionally been Protestant.
At the present moment of time, I think we'll have about 2 or 3 people from the Short Strand area.
Have you tried to encourage Roman Catholics to come and work here?
No, the company has made no attempt in this direction.
We have found many companies in Northern Ireland, many companies in Belfast, which simply employ almost 100% Protestants. We have other companies in an area like Derry where it is the other way around.
I would like to see done to the Fair Employment Agency is that it is disbanded forthwith.
Being shown around East Belfast by one of the local community representatives, as it were, and they came past a pub, and the guy said to the American, see the guys in there, if they had a choice of getting their hands on Gerry Adams or on Bob Cooper, they'd go for Bob Cooper every time.
I get threats. Many people get threats. I have as many threats probably as most people in Northern Ireland.
And the establishment didn't like that the agency had the power to investigate all employers, even the upper echelons of the civil service.
Did Minister of State Hugh Rossi ask you not to do the civil service report?
I told him it was our intention to do a report on the civil service, an investigation of the civil service, and he suggested that he would really rather we didn't, because he felt that things were improving quite a lot. We did not accede to his desire that we shouldn't investigate the civil service.
3 years ago, the government set up a fair employment agency for Northern Ireland to make sure that Catholics and Protestants have equal chances at work. We can reveal that is not happening. If they're Catholic, they're more than twice as likely to be unemployed as their Protestant counterparts. If a company has always had a 95% Protestant workforce, then it's likely it always will, partly because many boys will only hear of job vacancies through their family or friends in their own area.
Hope to get into Gallagher's.
And how will you do that?
My father got my form out of it because he works on it and filled it in and sent it in.
How have you gone about trying to get a job?
My uncles are trying to get me into it.
He's gone into the shipyard and I asked him could he get me one. He said okay and he got it.
Even though Protestants had work in the shipyard and apprenticeships and other industries in East Belfast, it masked a much greater problem in terms of educational disadvantage because they were leaving school at an early age with barely capable to read or write, but they were getting jobs in the shipyard.
But in Catholic West Belfast, it's not so easy, and for many of the children and families, there remains a real fear of working in traditionally Protestant industries. What happened when you took the boys to the shipyard?
Well, I took them down and we went round and the people were very good and helped us. But once the boys saw the bunting and the flags, they were completely put off. And when they came out and got into the minibus, the first thing they did was tear up the literature.
The big employers in Northern Ireland simply weren't cooperating with the Fair Employment Agency.
When we wrote and asked for basic information, not a question of making judgments, but basic information, they said no, and consistently went on saying no, until they were threatened with subpoena. Then they came across with information, which wasn't the specific information that we asked for.
Why did it take 4 years before Shorts agreed to an affirmative action programme? Why did it take that length of time?
Well, I think that's something which you'd ask the company.
In the 70s and 80s, there was a push for tougher anti-discrimination law from academics, from nationalists and from the FEA itself. But what really broke the logjam was pressure from America.
But I'm sailing across the sea to see my Uncle Sam.
The campaign across the US to get every state to accept the McBride principles has hit town. The dealings of American businessmen in Northern Ireland, how many Catholics, how many Protestants they may employ, has become everyone's business.
We have a right to tell American firms that they cannot join in an apparatus of discrimination.
They were named after Sean McBride. In 1984, McBride proposed that US companies, US pension funds and the US government itself should refuse to invest in Northern Ireland companies unless they signed up to his McBride principles.
The McBride Principles is a perfect way for Americans of conscience and justice to say, we don't want our dollars subsidising anti-Catholic discrimination.
The McBride Principles were enormously important in putting pressure on the British, and particularly the McBride campaign in Congress.
The McBride Principles did have a huge impact on the psychology of 10 Downing Street and London.
The government had to fight a rearguard action in the US to prevent American states, pension funds and companies from adopting the McBride Principles.
What would be tragic is people of good intent, of the best possible motive, but with, unfortunately, a misguided approach to this problem, were actually to pursue policies that may discourage further investment.
Bob Cooper wanted tougher fair employment laws, but thought McBride's threat of disinvestment went too far.
The people who are going to suffer from the enactment of this type of legislation are the people who were my former constituents in West Belfast.
He was acting under pressure from the government in London, from the Republic's government in Dublin, let alone the Nationalists in Northern Ireland, Washington and Brussels.
In a sense, there is an implication, since they are tied in with the South African investment and disinvestment measures, there's a sort of implication that it's slightly discreditable to invest, for an American company to invest in Northern Ireland.
He came to the conclusion, I can live with the unionist pressure if I keep the international people happy, and their picture is employ more Catholics. That was the whole regime.
Faced with the prospect of a massive loss of American investment, the government introduced a new Fair Employment Act. Having spent 5 years campaigning against the misguided McBride Principles, the government more or less adopted most of them in the new Fair Employment Act of 1989.
I will have very little sympathy indeed for those who seek to create problems or who point to difficulties, when merely that is an excuse for a latent sectarianism which they may be seeking to preserve in whichever area they operate.
The 1989 Fair Employment Act was the toughest piece of anti-discrimination law in Europe. And who introduced it? Margaret Thatcher. Yes, Margaret Thatcher. And does she get a word of thanks in West Belfast? Does she? Frankly, no.
I wouldn't give any nod of thanks to Margaret Thatcher for anything, given her very poor reputation. I think sometimes the British government done these things more out of care for their own interests than for anybody else's, i.e. not being accused by the Americans of discriminating against Catholics.
People in Northern Ireland want to know that they are living in a fair and just society, in which the laws are fair, in which there is equality of opportunity.
The old FEA went. There was a new Fair Employment Commission, or FEC, and they had a far larger staff. They could initiate investigations against employers and stop employers getting government contracts if they didn't like what they saw. The 1989 Act required employers to monitor their workers. For the first time, they had to reveal the numbers of Catholics and Protestants they employed.
I'll have to start asking questions that I've never asked in my life. I have never felt it important to ask anybody's religion when I'm going to employ them as a sheet metal worker.
There were those who said if you start doing a kind of a head count, a sectarian head count within the workforce, it will put worker against worker.
We're talking about enforced monitoring, people being brought into the position of enforced sectarianism in the workforce. That is what it's going to be. People are going to be recruited on the basis of the fact that they are a minority Catholic or a minority Protestant.
Staff from the FEC would have to go in with a pile of personnel forms and go through them, where people had identified themselves as undetermined. You would do it by name, you would do it by school, and doing it that way helped explain why there wasn't quite the number of Shiite Muslims in Ballylongford Power Station as first came through on the returns.
Some companies reported that they had a very low, and I mean a very low, number of persons of one religion. We immediately began work with those companies to establish why and what were the reasons and what would bring about change.
For the first time, individuals could take complaints of religious discrimination to a public tribunal. And this is where I come in. The FEC's job was to eliminate discrimination and enforce tough new laws. So they employed a comedian.
Hello? New complaint, okay, thank you.
Yes, they gave me a job. And then they decided that one comedian wasn't enough. So they also employed Michael McDowell, better known as Billy the Peeler from Give Me Head Peace. We were employed as complaints officers, and our job was to help individuals who had complaints of discrimination to take their case to tribunal.
For me, it was about how people were treated in the workplace. So, I just thought it was wrong that somebody should be subjected to sectarian harassment. I thought it was wrong that somebody didn't get a job because of their perceived religion.
We all know about the compensation culture, you know the kind of thing. People suing the X Factor because they got Louis Walsh as a mentor. Well, there were real fears that when the Fair Employment Act was introduced, that would attract these no-hopers, these time wasters, these people who think taking a case of discrimination was like winning the lottery. The reality, however, was a lot different.
To say, look, I have worked somewhere or I have attempted to work somewhere, and the reason I've not got the job there or the reason I'm dissatisfied with what has happened is because I have suffered discrimination on grounds of my religion or my political belief. It's just as sensitive as you can get in Northern Ireland.
The case involved a security firm and a young girl who had suffered pretty systemic harassment throughout her employment. She'd actually put up with maybe 3 or 4 years of this behaviour. And one particular incident that she complained about was when the corporals were murdered. They had left all the pictures of the corporals being murdered on her desk. She'd gone out to lunch and these were all lying, opened on her desk because she was effectively the only Catholic working in that place.
Times were very different back then. In the early 1990s, the IRA and Loyalist campaigns were in full flight. This was the era of proxy bombs, of random shootings and of mortars fired at Downing Street. And workers don't live in a bubble. What was happening out in the streets often crept into the workplace.
Belfast Shankill Road this morning, one of the areas which the UFF in their statement yesterday said Catholics shouldn't go to work in. But major firms contacted today said they'd no signs that their Catholic employees had refused to come in.
Here were many people going to work, not for very large salaries, mind you, and they were risking life and limb while they were coming from work, and they were heading towards a workplace where the atmosphere was anything but friendly, you know, and in many ways they were the real heroes of the fair employment world.
While making this programme, we contacted a number of people who had taken and won cases of religious discrimination. But almost without exception, they declined the offer to talk about their experience on camera. Even 20 years on, issues of discrimination remain controversial and sensitive.
It was a major decision to take. If you recall, at that time in the early 90s, in terms of the general environment, there was mayhem here. It was in the middle of the conflict. Also, I had a very young family then. My children, my two daughters, were aged 2 and 4. I was working full-time and studying part-time for a degree, and had lost my mother to cancer the year before. All personal stuff as well. It makes it difficult because you enter into these things, you don't take it lightly. What it said was that tribunals should be structured in a way that a person could walk in off the street and be able to represent themselves. I didn't find that experience at all.
They tended to be very heavyweight lawyers employed by both sides in those certainly in those initial cases.
Was conducted very much as I would imagine a major criminal case would be conducted.
A shudder went through employers. Suddenly, a failure to take the new legislation seriously could cost a company an awful lot of money, as well as their reputation.
A headline along the lines of £25,000 paid for case of unlawful discrimination, you know, focuses attention.
We had cameramen from early morning if there was any particular case of interest on. So that was an additional hurdle that applicants had to encounter.
People were able to read in the papers what this particular firm had got up to, or what its employees had got up to, and that had a terrible impact. And you know, I don't know what effect that had on their suppliers, the people they were working to. I mean, there must have been questions asked, and I think that was a wake-up call to a lot of employers that this couldn't go on.
Many cases actually settled before they reached the tribunal. Many employers said they only settled even though they hadn't discriminated because they were afraid of losing or because of the cost of defending themselves. Whereas the FEC thought many employers only settled because they knew their case was hopeless.
You'd ask, why do you feel you have been discriminated against? And they'd say, well, they make me go for the tea, or I have to get the sandwiches, or I do more photocopying than anybody else. And with a case kind of like that, and it wasn't really going terribly well. It was the third day in, he said, I don't know if this is relevant, but I was given this on my birthday. And he produced this medallion which had a ribbon in the colours of the Irish Tricolor, but written on the medallion was Fenian C of the Year Award. And so this had been given by his employees, so that kind of changed the dynamics of the case. So we brought it around to the other side and decided, well, as soon as they saw this thing, they settled immediately.
In landmark cases, the list of employers who were either found guilty of discrimination or who admitted to it included local and district councils, major retailers, manufacturers, car companies, security firms, health boards. The government had introduced the legislation, but even government departments were being sued. And crucially, the Commission didn't just take cases alleging Protestant bias. They also took and won a number of cases against mainly Catholic employers, proving that discrimination in Northern Ireland affected both communities.
There were clearly workplaces which had a very low proportion of Protestants, and the agency and the Commission worked as fervently with those companies as they did with companies that had an underrepresentation of Catholics.
The actual decisions of the tribunal carried a lot of weight, and I think it made a lot of employers wake up and take notice and say, like, we don't really need A, the publicity that surrounds a case, B, a decision from a court saying that we are discriminators, and thirdly, the amount of money we have to pay out for this. So I think that was absolutely critical in turning around the equality agenda in Northern Ireland.
Bigger firms and public sector employers quickly got the message, and it soon filtered down to smaller companies. The old ways of a nod and a wink and getting a job because of which foot you kicked with were on their way out. And a number of cases were also taken to ensure the removal of flags, emblems and bunting from the workplace. Gone were the days of the mini 12th around the factory floor.
One of the shop stewards said, right, are you telling us that if someone puts a flag on the end of the jib of a crane, that Bob Cooper would come and take it down? And I said, yes, he would. Next question, please.
The Fair Employment Act of 1989 worked. Workplaces are more neutral, more integrated. The religious breakdown of the workforce more or less reflects the population of Northern Ireland. The Act changed Northern Ireland society dramatically and effectively removed religious discrimination as a huge political issue. Well, until recently. The removal of the Union flag from the City Hall except on designated days is a direct result of equality legislation. So, before we go patting ourselves on the back, perhaps it's time to ask, have things gone too far?
I've referred to it as the swinging of the pendulum. I think now the most disadvantaged thing to be in Northern Ireland is a Protestant male.
We had the case of the police service in Northern Ireland for 10 years where we had this 50-50 rule, which was a specific religious bar on recruiting numbers of Protestants because too many Protestants applied and therefore numbers were excluded specifically on their religion.
Now within the civil service, if you are a Catholic applicant, probably a female applicant, your chances of promotion through the ranks it seems to be enhanced.
It is certainly true to say that the Fair Employment Act has not been the answer to all our problems.
What they should be targeting is the haves and the have-nots, whether they be Catholic, Protestant or of no religion. The big difference and problems in Northern Ireland are between those who have and those who have not, and we know what that means.
We're still very segregated along religious lines. We still live in our ghettos. We still live in areas where people don't know each other and have no notion of getting to know each other. So there's still a lot of work to do in terms of building peace and breaking down those barriers, because that's where discrimination and prejudice come from, not knowing one another.
It may well be in the future in places like Newry and Derry and so on that the fair employment legislation will be to the Unionists or Protestants' advantage.
So, did the Fair Employment Act really make Northern Ireland a better place?
We still have a way to go, but are we on the right track? Absolutely. Did the Fair Employment Act contribute to that? Absolutely.
Do you sometimes wish you got that job as a car mechanic?
Well, you talked about here we are now, but look where we are now. I'm sitting here in Stormont.
You got a job as a car mechanic, you wouldn't have ended up here.
Yeah, well, I think that it's all very, very interesting, but it's all very serious.
When I look around now and see the change, I mean, you don't hear very often of cases of religious discrimination anymore, and I hope that's because the system is better, employers try harder, and workers feel they are covered and protected.
I think peace in this country could not have been achieved without the work of the Fair Employment Commission creating equality in the workplace. It was a serious running sore for Northern Ireland.
Whatever it is that divides us today, it's rarely said to be sectarianism in employment. Religious discrimination no longer forces people to march or protest. Of course, the Act has now been extended to include sex and race and disability and even age. That's why you have to fill in all those stupid forms. On the plus side, however, if you have recently got a job, it's probably because you were the best candidate for it. So well done, and give a little nod of thanks to the Fair Employment Act of 1989.